guys. As a person who went to Michigan, I'm contractually obligated to say go blue. Also, we're a basketball school now. Purely basketball. That's all we do. I want to start out tonight by thanking Fire for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's an absolute honor not only to be asked to be here this evening, but to speak to you, the people, the students, who are in the very midst of some of the hardest, stupidest, worst, best, most challenging debates over speech being held today. I find that when I'm doing a speaking event and I look down and then I realize I'm looking down and you're looking at me looking down and I'm like, ugh, life is challenging. Anyway, you're here today at this conference because you are representing, or more honestly for all of us, trying to represent a very important faction of American life. The faction of Americans who truly believe in the power and worthiness of free speech. That means a few things. It probably means that you already know that the fire in a crowded theater analogy first wielded by Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was used in defense of restrictions on the speech of American socialists and was ultimately overturned by the court in the late 1960s. It means you've probably said things like the only solution to bad speech is more speech, which is true, and you meant it when you said it. It also means, and I'm very sorry to say it, that you are going to have to deal with some incredibly stupid shit. The concept of free speech is very easy to embrace. It's like a 3-day weekend or 35% off all markdowns. You don't need to think too hard to get behind it. At least, that is, in theory. But the actual lived experience of free speech is hard. Really, really hard. And in part, that's because some of the biggest purported backers of free speech, and yes, I am using air quotes, and I did write down that I'm going to use air quotes so you know it's real, are largely supportive of their freedom to speak and the freedom of other people to shut the hell up. Their speech is good and righteous and a balm to all who hear it, and the speech of other people is dangerous and bad and mean and upsetting and probably illegal. If anyone knows that, it's this organization, an organization that stood with law student Nicholas Wallace when he satirized the Federalist Society, and an organization that stood with conservative students at the University of Miami who were prevented from starting a campus organization, and with an art museum at the University of Kansas that displayed flag art that many people did not like. In their defense, the art was not great. The faction of people who allied themselves with Fire to defend Nicholas Wallace may likely shy away from fighting for conservative students on campus. And let's be real here. The faction of people who support the rights of conservatives to speak on campus isn't always the most supportive of the rights of other people to speak on campus. It is very easy to support the speech of people you like. It is very, very hard to support the speech of people you hate. Or, as I would know, to support the speech of people who hate you and who do not wish for you to speak online or on campus or while being alive or anything. Ask anyone who has spoken out both for the speech of BDS activists and for Zionist organizations on college campuses. Or, let's be real, check their Twitter mentions. The people who will support you in your fight for the speech of people within their faction will often purport to be your friends. They will hail your efforts to defend their speech, and their speech alone, as you'll find. But as former Fire President David French wrote this week, faction friendships are also fragile. They depend on an extraordinary degree of agreement and conformity. I've experienced this myself. Many of us have. Friendships built up through years of engagement in politics and activism vanished in the blink of a tweet. You're not with us? Well, we're not with you. The faction of Americans who truly believe in the power and worthiness of free speech, and that goes for unpopular speech, unpleasant speech, and speech that is stupid, is not big. That faction is not widely represented in our politics because, unfortunately, the power and worthiness of the fight for people you hate to say things in public is not a political message many people will go out on a limb for. It's not widely represented in our culture because, unfortunately, fighting for the speech of terrible people isn't very popular. or fun, or Instagrammable. And honestly, it's easy for me to stand here and tell you that the fight for free speech is worth it. It's much harder for me and you to live that in my daily life. Because you will always be asked, are you really going to go to the mat for that guy? And your answer is, yeah. Even though a lot of times the person asking yourself that question is you. Because you know that if the tables were turned, that guy who you're defending, might not stand up for you. Or worse, they'll demand that your speech be curtailed because it makes them mad or sad or feel bad about themselves. Giving a speech, it's not that hard. You stand here, you talk into a microphone, you look at people, you do the thing where you try to look at everyone in the room, and then you look back at your notes, and then you look around a little bit more, and then you're done. I'm doing it right now. But standing up for speech, that's hard. But you're doing it right now. You've already taken a big step forward, standing in public to say that you have a faction of your own, the faction of Americans who really, truly believe that free speech matters, and that defending unpopular speech is defending your own right to speak. And over this weekend, you're going to learn how to put that belief into action. But I also want you to think about why you're doing so too. Because this is a fight where genuine allies will be few and far between, and most of your alliances will be transactional in nature. Where sometimes you're fighting for the right to swear on Snapchat, and sometimes you're fighting for the right to be on campus in the first place. Frederick Douglass wrote a speech in 1860 following a mob attack on an abolitionist gathering in Boston. Some had concern-trolled the gathering for taking place, arguing in some way that it had caused the mob to attack by being ill-timed because nothing changes. In response, Douglass said, "Why, what is the matter with us? Are we going to excuse a palpable and flagrant outrage on the right of speech by implying that only a particular description of persons should exercise that right? Are we, at such a time when a great principle has been struck down, to quench the moral indignation which the deed excites by casting reflections upon those on whose persons the outrage has been committed? I.e., are we really going to blame ourselves for people trying to attack us for being against slavery?" It would be no vindication of the right to speech to prove that certain gentlemen of great distinction, eminent for their learning and ability, are allowed to freely express their opinions on all subjects, including the subject of slavery. Such a vindication would need itself to be vindicated. It would add insult to injury. There can be no right of speech where any man, however lifted up or however humble, however young or however old, is overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments. The principle must rest on its own proper basis, and until the right is accorded to the humblest as freely as to the most exalted citizen, the government of Boston, where this mob took place, is but an empty name and its freedom a mockery. A man's right to speak does not depend on where he was born or upon his color. The simple quality of manhood is the solid basis of the right, and let it there rest forever. And because I can't really add anything to Frederick Douglass, I think that's it from me. And I know that there might be some questions, and I am looking forward to hearing them. I'm also going to wander. Can you guys hear me if I stand over here? Oh. Ooh, it's like old school Oprah. I can also project. That'd be helpful a lot in my life. Hello, can you hear me? Hi, I think you had a question? Hang on, I'm wearing heels. I'm rambling. Hi, what's going on?
We hear so much bad news, people getting shut down in college campuses, getting fired from their jobs, stuff like that. Do you have any good news to report?
The good news is that you heard about it. I think in many ways, when you're hearing about restrictions on speech, that itself is a win. If you think about even going to college campuses in the 1950s and 1960s, the first free speech movement on college campuses came because those types of firings and that type of treatment was not just endemic, but expected. And this is at an era in which many institutions had a proper number of Jewish people who were permitted to attend. So the fact that we find inherently someone getting fired for having an opinion and voicing it, we find that anathema. That's why it becomes news. And I think that the fact that we're thinking about this fact that organizations such as this exist, yes, it exists because there's a problem, but it also exists because a lot of people are angry about the problem and want to do something about it. Any other questions? Hi.
So, do you think there is any role for social media companies to play when it comes to stopping like misinformation or something like that, or is there any sort of balance here? Or?
Did you just check the news of maybe something that came up this afternoon about certain press secretaries saying that maybe certain social media companies should cut down on certain misinformation? The answer to your question is that I am a strong proponent of social media companies recognizing the responsibility they do have without being induced by the government to do something. And I think that we see that, it's interesting, this relationship we see between, say, well, I was going to say conservatives, but I'm like, it's a conflict between Republicans and Democrats and social media companies. Because you have Democrats wanting social media companies to curtail COVID-19 misinformation. And then you have Republicans being like, this is evidence that they're state-run. Ergo, we should make them state-run. Because life and politics are complicated. I think that the challenge is that these are private companies. And there is this notion we have of what a private company should look like, and that we believe that at a certain level of power, we're like, well, they're just not private anymore. When that's not true. Like, you don't stop being a private entity just because you're a very large corporation. And I think that the role these companies should have is, yes, you understand your responsibility, and because of the wonders of Section 230, you have the right to edit, moderate, and delete content and users, third-party content, as in your content, that you see fit. But the government telling you to do so is problematic, especially because all of the things that I think of misinformation, we don't agree necessarily on what that means. And I always think about, and this doesn't work on many people all the time, but I'm always like, what if the worst person you know becomes president? And they're like, well, I think misinformation is X. And you're like, that's stupid. So I think my governing principle is that, even if I would want the government to do a thing, would I want the government empowered by the worst person I know to do that thing? And the answer is, oh, no, that would be bad and terrifying and very concerning. So I think that's my general thought here. It's complicated because I wish I could give you all, they should do this, but I have very few answers and mostly questions.
Thanks so much for talking. I'm a really big fan of your work. So my question is kind of about power. So I know in a lot of cases of free speech, it's like a power struggle. Like the government can censor you, Facebook can censor you. If a critical mass of people in a mob can censor you, it often feels like you're powerless when you're the only dissenter. So what is your advice for people who may not have the power to kick someone out, or the power to maybe hold a gun to their head like the government, or the power to silence people through social protest when it's just one person or one entity with no power?
I think that is a really challenging and good question. And I think that for me, I think about, it's interesting because you don't, did we lose? Okay, we're back. What power will look like in the future. I actually, on the train here, I was looking at a old Daily Mail article from 1993, actually July 16th, 1993. And I believe the headline is something like, "Abortion hopes as gay gene found." The article implying that wouldn't it be great, it is great, if we could find a genetic reason for people being gay so that their mothers could choose abortions. So the people who we think of as having larger or increasing societal power. Now that wasn't always true. And you can think about any number of social movements where power lay before is not where power lies now. But if you're alone and not in power right now, that doesn't really matter much. You're probably thinking like, yeah, I can't really wait 25 years to be like, yeah, I was right the whole time. But for me, in those moments, I recognize that it's very hard to be alone on something. And it's hard, especially when people who are you think of as being your allies are like, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with you. They back away from you. But you stand up for you. You refuse to back away. And I think that those moments are incredibly challenging. I won't lie to you and say that it is enjoyable to be screamed at or to have your job threatened because somebody got mad at something. Or even for something where an entire group thinks that this is correct and you're like, I don't think so. That's hard. It's also hard when you recognize that like you could also be wrong about that thing. You don't know. And so I think that the most important thing is that you back you. You understand that it's important to make your stand. It's important to understand where your stand is coming from. This is a side note, but I have increasingly grown to very much dislike people who are like, well, if all these people say X, then I'm going to say Y to trigger them. And I'm like, but that's not a reason. That's just like, you're annoying. I mean, like, you have the right to be annoying. And I have the right to be like, wow, you're annoying. But that's not what you're doing. You have the right to hold your opinion, to understand your opinion, to have people attempt to change your mind and say no. But you have to back you. And I think that that's the most important thing. I know that that's not as helpful. I wish I could tell you that, like, then these people were coming and fight on your behalf, and it's going to be amazing. It's going to be like, I don't know, like the end of Deadpool 2 or something. But no, I regret that that's not what happens. But what happens is that you know where you stood on this, and whether or not you're eventually proven right by history, you stood up for you.
Thank you for the speed, Jane. I embarrassingly agree that I'm part of the free speech echo chamber, and it's unfortunately dominated by a libertarian inkling to it. So within that echo chamber, a controversial or sort of unpopular opinion I hold is that big media does have a role in our sort of in the market of ideas. But we see this rise of decentralized media with Substack and with um, you know so many people going independent and then making a lot of money out of it. As somebody who believes in Washington Post and New York Times is good because they have a legacy and if they direct resources in the right place, they can do good stuff. How can we reinstill faith back into these institutions? Or how can these institutions reinstill faith back into them for the general populace? Thank you.
As a libertarian, I resent the earlier accusation. But also as a libertarian, I who strongly, the Libertarian Party. That's a separate issue. Anyway, well, I think that it's twofold because what I see, it is interesting to now work at a media entity that people get very upset at, and I'm like, oh no, you're upset at these other people. I'm over here. I'm just making a podcast. Just a nice friend. Okay, it's not very friendly, but a nice podcast. But I think that there's a two-prong answer to your question. First, I think that media institutions, part of the reason why you become a legacy media institution is because you have decades of having been the first there or being the person that people rely upon. And you see this, the funniest thing in the world I see is the people who are like the angriest at my publication who still put New York Times bestseller in their header bio. But that's an appeal to authority. We all do this of being like, well, this guy said so. So it's not just you. Like, it's the same way that, like, I have an older sister, and I, for some reason, believe that she would never lie to me. She lied a lot. But I would always be like, well, my sister said that this was definitely true. And then people would be like, she lied. Sorry. But I think that what those media entities, I think, for a long time, and this is something I've talked about at work all the time, is that, like, you can't rest on being the New York Times or the Washington Post. You can't just be like, well, we're just the New York Times and you're not, so life's tough. And I think that when you see the work that a lot of these entities do, where they are going to war zones or they are doing the work that is critical, I think that that's definitely where it's like, this is why this entity is this. But then you also see major media publications that are basically like, well, we just said so. Why don't you believe us? But I think that the second part here is that whenever people say that, like, they don't trust the media, the implication there is that there is something they do trust, because I think of the media as being a much wider space than other people tend to think of it. And so I have numerous people who work for Fox News or any other conservative media outlet, and they'll be like, well, I'm not a part of the media. And I'm like, buddy, those town cars get paid for by somebody. So I think that it's worth noting, like, why is it that this entity is trustworthy and this entity is not trustworthy? And so I think that it's worth noting that your trust for an outlet and that outlet's willingness to tell you what you want to hear, those two things often are related but shouldn't be. And if that's what you want from a media outlet, and let me tell you that when the Times runs conservative opinions or has someone even on my podcast or other podcasts, or does something that does not make a very liberal but like centrist liberal readership base happy, we get emails. And they're very mean and long. I'm like, wow, you've got time. So I think that it comes from I know this is a meandering answer, but I'm thinking about this in real time. I think, to the first point, I think that people who work within media institutions, who have worked and fought so long to get within those media institutions. I moved to DC in 2010 in the midst of the Great Recession, and I could not afford to have an internship at a lot of media organizations because Politico was like, well, if we pay you nothing and you work 20 hours a day, someday you might turn into something. And I could not do that. So that's why I worked as a speechwriter and a press secretary and then covered college sports at night. And I think that for a lot of people who are within those institutions, you get kind of siloed into not just a certain way of thinking, but a certain way of thinking about your institution, of being like, well, we ran it, so it must be correct. And as anyone who has been alive for longer than 15 minutes would know, that just because a major publication ran that piece of information does not mean it's correct. But I would also say that rejecting information you don't like, or because you find it concerning to your worldview, I would say is also problematic. I think that there are a lot of people, and it's interesting also because when you see people breaking off onto Substack or elsewhere, you get a sense that there are people who are fans of that journalist, not just because of their work, but because of their whole milieu. Like, you don't just like Glenn Greenwald's writing, you like the fact that Glenn Greenwald will fight with literally anyone on the internet. Very nice in person, by the way. But you see, there's something about that, and I think that that's a kind of fandom culture that I didn't really expect. So I think it's a multifaceted issue, but I think to build trust in media institutions, I think that it just takes doing more reporting, doing more work, and then thinking about your audience as being potentially anyone. I think, when the Times sometimes writes about DC, they write about DC like it's like a weird stepsister that lives under the stairs. And I'm always like, that it's a real city that we have. Our buildings are short, but that's the right size for what buildings should be. And I think that respecting your audience, respecting your audience's decisions, and also being willing to give your audience things they don't always like because it challenges them or provokes them. Not in a clickbaity way, not in a you won't believe what op-ed we published. Though that would be a really good headline. In that kind of way, you have to be willing to grow your audience, to think about your audience, think about your relationship with your audience, and recognize that like trying to make your audience happy is not your job. Your job is to inform and assist your audience, even if they don't like it. But also, don't choose a news source because it tells you things you like. Or do. I mean, it's up to you. But I would rather you didn't. Did you have a question? Awesome. Okay. I'm going to meander this way.
Hi. I'm so happy that your podcast exists. Thank you for speaking with us. So, this is going to be a difficult question, and I'm sorry, but I have to ask. What do you think about the extent of revolving doors of people who seek to control and censor speech in social media companies, in the government, in the media, and in other institutions? And what do you think about how a culture of free speech and really a culture of following the scientific method can be applied and created such that it's so widespread that it covers all of those different arenas?
So you're asking about like the revolving door between like social media companies and government and all these businesses?
All of those things, and how the ideology of censorship for the public good can be such a multi-headed hydra that it can take so many different forms, and it's maybe it's not even possible that one culture can decapitate all of it.
Well, I think the challenge there is that we will always have. I'll give you an example. So, the founder of the American Nazi Party was George Lincoln Rockwell. And in the early 1960s, before he got murdered by a member of the American Nazi Party, because that's how these things happen, he did a campus speaking tour. And he went to Michigan State and talked about how great it was to be a Nazi. And then people yelled at him, and he said, like, your boos only make me stronger, or something like that. I think that's actually like a Rick and Morty thing, but like, I've seen what you cheer. But I think that we have this idea of free speech, and we also have this idea of speech that's anathema. And what is anathema and what is free changes over time. And so the example I gave about the fire in a crowded theater, that was from a Supreme Court decision during, right before involvement in World War I, in which all the American socialists had done was like express your right to speech. They'd written pamphlets that were basically like, you can oppose this war. And the Supreme Court was like, you absolutely cannot. Hell no. And we've seen that in court cases. For instance, Jehovah's Witness family challenged being forced to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance in 1941 during the outbreak of the Second World War, and the Supreme Court said no. And then they overturned it in a pretty great decision. But this back and forth is really hard for people, and especially because you have people within. I don't like using the word elite because I think of elite as a class perspective, and then a lot of people think of the elites as being like you live in a certain place or have certain jobs or have attended certain universities, which there's some crossover, but it's challenging. I do think people in positions of power, I would say, often think that there is settled agreement on what is free speech and permissible and what is anathema. And those same people tend to be in charge of a lot of those institutions. The challenging thing there is that, like, I would rather George Lincoln Rockwell not show up at my college campus. And I would just personally prefer that. It's a public university, he would have every right to do so. But the way that you could stand up to George Lincoln Rockwell was probably by just not showing up and going to do something else, which is generally what works on those kinds of people. But I think that the fight for speech, too often we are very willing to fight for specific kinds of speech that we like, And then when it comes to speech that we personally find anathema, we can find ways around that. And you see that with people who are very valiant supporters of free speech until it comes to the BDS movement, or until it comes to animal rights activists, or until it comes to, I wrote about this, is actually when I first got connected with FIRES, I wrote about, at the University of Kansas, someone made art out of a flag and they put a sock on it, and everyone got very offended, and they demanded that the state of Kansas started issuing letters demanding that this art be burned, which I was like, it's bad, but it's not that bad. And like, simmer down. But that's a type of speech in which you see people who are like, I would die for the right to speech, but if you make fun of the flag, very offended. And I think that that's something that's pretty common to all of us. There are forms of speech that we individually find anathema or out of bounds. And there are forms of speech that we're like, great, that sounds amazing. And the challenge we have right now is that the people in power all have pretty similar ideas about the speech that they're into. And I think the way that you deal with that is to, for one thing, challenge the power structures that render them incredibly powerful. Like, Mark Zuckerberg wanted to determine who was hot and who was not at Harvard, and now he's wakeboarding and being extremely wealthy and running Facebook. That's not how it always has to be. And I think it's worthwhile to think about speech as a constant, it's not set in stone. Speech and speech norms change over time, which I'm frankly thrilled about because people don't really refer to me as a mulatto anymore. Though, it's not the worst thing I've been called. So I think that thinking about how those norms are created and then reinforced, not because they're good or correct, but because they're the norm, and thinking about how the people who enforce those norms, they're in their positions not because we voted for them, but because they happen to have assumed that power, and then recognizing that you have the opportunity to work outside of that power and to challenge that power in your daily life and through the work that you'll do on campus and elsewhere. And I think it's hard. It's really hard. And I now work for a giant Death Star organization, but it's a very nice Death Star. And it can be hard where you're thinking like, wow, people tend to be thinking about this in a very similar way, and I'm thinking about it in a different way. But I have the opportunity to say like, well, I don't think that. So let me do a podcast about it and argue with someone about it. And I'm aware that that is a tremendous privilege of mine. And that's something I take incredibly seriously, that not everybody gets to yell publicly on the internet about something. But I think that you do have an opportunity, and I would say in some ways a responsibility, to challenge those power structures and to recognize where your own biases towards speech you like and away from speech you don't like come in. Now, those biases are totally fine. Like, I hope you're kind of biased against racist speech, but like, whether or not that speech is bad does not mean it's not permitted to be said. You can just yell at it, or challenge it, or correct it, or ignore it. I find ignoring things to be very helpful. But I think that those power structures aren't there because they were the best ones. Those power structures are there because of a series of circumstances. And I think being willing to challenge them and challenge yourself is important. Is that helpful? Okay. Okay, good. Although, what if we're both wrong? Speech. It's true.
You mentioned this subject earlier. What do you think is the future of Section 230 in light of the ongoing Trump big tech lawsuit? Do you think there might be some positive change coming out of this for social media users?
I love Section 230, the greatest 26 words in the history of time. Interestingly, Section 230 was part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which was struck down because it was supposed to be anti-obscenity. And the Supreme Court's like, what's obscenity? And everyone was like, I don't know. And yeah, so no. Here I will give you both my desperate pleading hope, and I will give you what I think might actually happen. So my desperate pleading hope is that everyone understands that Section 230 protects you, the internet user, so that you could have and post on a website using your content, and that would not be shut down. Section 230, a lot of times people talk about it as like only in relation to Twitter or Facebook, as if those are the only two websites, but like Section 230 is why ChristianMingle.com doesn't have to let someone write Hail Satan on ChristianMingle.com. It's why Satanists could say, we would rather you not proselytize about Jesus here. Then everybody is happy. They're not happy. No one's happy. And I think that the fact that Section 230 exists is why you can have comment sections. It's why the terms of service of any platform that permits user speech. I think one of the funnier things is that the Trump-endorsed-ish Getter social media service, its terms of service are very clear that it will not permit bullying or obscenity or anything they determine to be offensive. And that's because of Section 230. And so I want people to understand that this is a protection that permits speech on the internet. Without Section 230, every website that permits user speech would then be absolutely subsumed by lawsuits and would just likely shut down. And then whenever I say that, people are like, good, we don't need Twitter. And I'm like, no, it's not a need thing. It's a like I will not die without Twitter, but I like having it, and I like having the platform on which to speak. And if Twitter wanted to throw me off, I'd be like, okay. And I think that one of the things that concerns me is right now, you may have seen that Facebook is doing a lot of ads about like, do you remember 1996? It was a long time ago. We need new internet regulations. The reason they're doing that is because Facebook is the only entity large enough to be like, we could moderate ourselves. Everything would be totally fine. Please give us power. And Twitter doesn't have that. It doesn't have the user base. And a lot of other websites don't have that. And I think that it's worth noting that like if Facebook is super into the same internet regulations that Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley all want, I'm immediately like, that's a no. That's a no from me. I am suspicious. So I would not be surprised if Section 230 is saved, but there is antitrust legislation against Facebook, antitrust legislation that would wind up in court for the next 1,000 years. I think that Section 230 is the kind of thing that now has become a useful campaign cudgel, but clearly enough people have told enough politicians that it actually is a good thing that they don't ever really try to do anything about it besides have Facebook and Twitter folks up to the hill to ask them how to turn on their iPhone, which is a thing that really happened. So I hope nothing happens to Section 230. I fear something stupid is going to happen to Section 230. And because of how life works, it's probably going to be something dumb that happens. Do you have a question?
So thank you for the talk. It was amazing. You mentioned previously, just in the last question and also throughout the discussion, about the line between private social media companies and private companies in general, Section 230, and the government shouldn't encroach on that. As a student of a private university, does that mean that there's no hope in pushing in the opposite direction, in allowing for pushing against hate speech and all that? Because if you have this hands-off policy where the government says, like, private companies, you can do your own thing, you can moderate your own websites, we're not going to interfere, doesn't that allow for private universities to say at that point, okay, so we're just going to allow for hate speech regulation, you can't put up these kinds of posters? Isn't that just going to make it more difficult for, private university students to push for free speech on campus?
I think it already is quite challenging for students at private universities to push for free speech on campus. I went to a public university, but I went to private Catholic high school and grade school where we weren't allowed to do a lot of things, which, I wasn't a huge fan of at the time, but I was also like 14 and mostly listening to... Oh, the microphone cut out. censorship. What I was saying is that I just listened to Nine Inch Nails by myself in a room. Instead of protesting for my speech rights, which is probably what I should have done. But I do think that the challenge you have then at a private institution is recognizing that, yes, that institution could do that thing, but should they? And how will the campus community respond? And I think we've seen time and again with organizations like FIRE where they can say, like, yes, you can do this, but we will make it deeply unpleasant for you to do so. And making things unpleasant for university administrators is, one, super fun, and two, their own private hell. So I think that there are many things can be true at once. Like, yes, it's going to be harder, but it's still going to be worth it for you to participate in that fight, especially if your fight is from the perspective of speech, of thinking about what does so-called hate speech really mean and who gets to determine what that looks like. This is not a school example, but there was a recent story of a woman being charged with a hate crime because she destroyed a Back the Blue sign. Because in numerous jurisdictions, police are a protected category alongside race and sexual orientation. And I think that for a lot of people who are supportive of hate crimes legislation, when you add in cops, they were like, hang on a second. And then I'm like, you should think that, like, let's extrapolate outwards. So I think, yes, it will be hard. Yes, it will be worth it.
So you had mentioned earlier how there are some individuals who just have an opposing opinion just to have an opposing opinion because they can. So what is one way to hold yourself accountable or know that your reasoning is reasonable?
I'm not going to get into a discussion of the nature of reason because you will have things to do. But I will say that for me, this is very challenging because there's always two people kind of fighting in your head. There's the person who's like, I hold this position. I probably hold this position for good reasons. If you oppose my position, ergo, you're a bad person. But then there's the other person who's like, I've been wrong. What if I'm wrong about this? What if I'm wrong about everything? And it's challenging. So what I would say is not all of your viewpoints will be objective or reasonable. You have strong views on certain subjects. What I would do is make sure you know everything about why you have that view. And if you can read contrary evidence or contrary opinions and think about how you would rebut them and think about how you could engage with those perspectives, not with the intention necessarily of changing anyone else's mind. Because there are certain subjects like on abortion or the death penalty, for example, where that's not going to happen. Because again, those viewpoints are a lot of times we enmesh them in like, well, look at this study and this other study. But at the baseline, a lot of it is, I just think this. And that's okay. If you are able to, I would say, shore up that viewpoint in, here's why I think this, I understand that you might disagree about this, and I get that, like, this isn't something where either of us need to change our mind. But if you know everything about the position, and also do leave yourself open to changing your mind. I've changed my mind on a host of issues. I've probably talked about it online, but like on gun rights and the other issues, I learned more about it and changed my view, which everyone is allowed to do. But there are going to be a lot of things you don't change your mind on, and that's okay if you know how you got there, and you don't assume that people who have the opposite view got there because they hate you. They might, but probably not.
Hi. So you work at the New York Times. And we hear accounts of people like Barry Weiss, like Jonathan Weissman, who are kind of sacked, kicked out, or quit, the Death Star institution because they said something that was not palatable or they want to publish something that was not palatable. You, on the other hand, have a podcast that argues with people on certain issues that are still run by the New York Times. Do you think that you, and I'm sorry I'm saying this, but as a part of a minority that seems to, as a minority, are gaining a lot more power in this new structure of power, do you think that helps you? Do you think that being a minority kind of shields you from that? You get what I mean?
Well, I would say the answer is yes in some ways and no in other ways. Because for one thing, I would say that it's interesting how my minority status gets wielded by people who are not me. And I'm like, I didn't sign on to this. But I would say it is helpful. And I'll say in a couple of ways, because this is complicated. In the first way, I would say that occasionally I know that like my positionality gets used not by me, but as a means by which people challenge their own perspectives. And other people doing that, that's not really up to me. But it is interesting when you see people, and this happens to me quite a bit, where they're like, she's non-white, non-heterosexual, and a libertarian? Whoa! And it's like, there is an expectation, I think, for minorities, and I get this both positively and negatively, where it's like we all have a big meeting, and we all got together, and we hammered out a constitution on Zoom, and they were like, this is what black people think. And then there's like some black person who says something different, and people are like, how dare you? Didn't you read the Constitution? So I think that in some ways that can be helpful to have people who are like, well, if this person is saying this, maybe I should think about it in a different way. And that's not something I'm like, hooray, but it is an interesting thing to observe. I would say that on the negative side, there are, for one thing, I am often, I think, viewed as being part of an amorphous mass. And I would say that for a lot of reasons. Like, it's interesting where you are presumed to be like, you work at the New York Times, ergo you think these things, because I'm like, they did not ask me about that on my onboarding. Or that you're not white, and ergo you think these things. Or that you're not heterosexual, ergo you think these things, because again, there was a meeting, I guess. And so I think that in some ways, that's to my detriment. I don't ever, in many circles, get to be viewed as Jane Coaston. I am part of this group, or this group, or this group, or this community where I assume there must be community meetings, but nobody sends me invites. What I want to do, though, is recognize that I do have somewhat of a platform, and somewhat of a platform where, let's be real, trying to take it away from me would make some people unhappy. And I can use that to ask tough questions and talk about difficult issues and do things that I think that are different for the Times or for any other publication. Especially because I think a lot of times, a lot of the, how best to put this? Sometimes the willingness to listen and the willingness to be publicly wrong and the willingness to engage, I think can be more worthwhile than the willingness to hold an opinion in public. Because we all know that like there are sometimes people like, I've got an opinion, and people are like, oh, you're so brave. But it's like, are you willing to engage about that opinion and be challenged about that opinion and not just put up the, didn't you hear me? I have an opinion. You can't be mad at me. I want to engage with these ideas, with these opinions, with this platform, and I want to do that as myself. I happen to be bringing in numerous interesting identity markers. Interestingly, people don't ask about like, oh, your grandfather served at Normandy. They don't mean that identity marker, though that's a cool one. I think that I want to use this opportunity to do the work that I think is the best work I can do, and more importantly, work that my audience deserves. My audience of people who are coming to the show from what it previously was, or have never heard it before, or have never listened to a podcast, like my parents, where they were like, oh, like, how do we subscribe to a podcast? And I was like, well, you can do it on an app in your phone. And they're like, what's an app? And I was like, maybe I'll just mail you transcripts. So I think that that's how I engage with that. But I won't lie, it's weird. It is weird to have something about yourself that people are like, you're bringing this in. And I'm like, oh, I'm bringing what in? My hair? My hair is very cool. But like, it's hard. That's what I'd say. I think, hi.
Hello. I always think about, like trust, and like we often trust like people as people that we know. And I think like it goes back to the sort of the like personality. People trust a personality as if it's someone they know. But it's also a lot of my opinions have been changed by people in my life, not necessarily by reading things on the internet. And also that's how, some of the what people might describe as like fringe opinions are formed too, is in like real communities that are people actually talking to each other. So in the role of the internet, in your opinion, what is the role of people who might not want to get up on Twitter and talk about it, but to foster those conversations like within our families and our social circles, and to not alienate people? Because I've fallen into the trap myself of being like, oh, this person thinks abortion should be illegal, I can't be friends with them. But, through conversation, we've come to an understanding. So like, how to foster that on a more personal, like real level, beyond what's on the internet.
Well, I think that one of the challenges we have is that the internet is inherently flattening, and you become your views, or you become like, you're that person on the internet. There's this joke on Twitter that's like, every day the goal on Twitter is to not be it. Like, you don't want to be the main character on Twitter, because that's probably bad. But that's flattening, and it is inherently so. And so the person who you spoke to who thinks that abortion should be illegal probably also has a lot of other thoughts on related things. Like, they're probably like, wedges, not into them. Like, pizza, pretty cool. Like, they exist as human beings, as fulsome human beings. And I think that that's how you have to come to this. And it's hard because now we have made having strong opinions an identity marker. And so there are people, you see it on Twitter or social media, where like they themselves are a brand, and their brand is having opinions on the internet about politics or culture. And I think that that's kind of depressing to me, because you think about like how fulsome and rich life is with people where you don't know their political views. And I think about I used to cover sports. I used to cover college football and the NFL. And there are people I spoke to for years where I had no idea what their political opinions were. And I was like, I don't really need to know your political opinion to know that you're wrong about past interference. But like, I think recognizing that the humans you are having actual conversations with on the internet are actual humans, and they are coming in with their foibles and their problems and all of their beliefs that were shaped in just as many weird ways as your beliefs were. But also that when you have the opportunity to engage in meet space with like actual human beings, think about like, they aren't just that perspective. And you don't know how they got there on that perspective. You don't know what may have taken place in their lives. And that's not to say that like, if someone says that like, I actually think apartheid's pretty awesome, you can be like, okay, bye. Like, that's totally fine. You have the right to disengage just as much as you have in some respects a responsibility to engage. But I think recognizing that people are coming to you just as full of opinions and thoughts and ideas that are half-baked, fully baked, less baked, just as much as you are, come to those conversations not as a debater, but as just a person. this is, as a side note, I strongly believe that debate team culture is bad because we have this idea that, like, well, if we just fight it out, one person will win, but that's how debate works. That's not how life works.
Hi, I'm Madeline Stapel. I'm a student at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State. And so a lot of stuff that we talk about in our classes are about objectivity and how that works in the mediascape. And so as someone who works in media, I was wondering about your comment on what's going on now, what you see the future of it is, and how it's changed, how it will change.
So, my good friend Wesley Lowery has talked a lot about objectivity, and I tend to agree with him on a lot of things. I think that there is, and you've probably talked about this a lot, that there is objectivity and then there's being fair to the people you're talking to. So objectivity to me implies that you're like, well, we couldn't possibly know who is correct and who is not correct. So it's like, on one hand, here's this person who says X, on other person, here's this person who says Y. Who could say who's correct? But like, sometimes you can say who is correct here. You can also report what they said and write it down and give the best case analysis of what it is. And I've done that in my reporting on conservatism and the American right. That's something that I really prided myself on, where these people were like, oh, we know that she's probably a Marxist, but she's like a fair Marxist. I'm not a Marxist. It seemed too hard. I like property. That is mine. But I think that for me is important because I think objectivity, the era of kind of thinking about journalistic objectivity was an era in which journalism and who got to perform it was a fairly limited class. And so even if you go back to sports writing of like the 1960s and 1970s, it's this very specific group of people who get to write about these very specific sports in this very specific way. And that means that they find African-American athletes who are taking part in the March on Washington. They're arguing like, well, isn't that a distraction from like your preparations for the NFL season? Of just being like, well, that's an objective perspective to have. And so I think that the goal for me, especially because now I'm in opinion and I can just say whatever I want. I mean, within some reasons, is I do work for a private entity that has the right to disengage with me. But I think that I have the right to be fair. There have been many people on my show where I have disagreed with them on the episode, but I also want to hear what they have to say. I want to push back with evidence, and I want them to get the most fulsome perspective that they have out there. Because I think that a lot of times we see, and I think that this is kind of in ideological media of all kinds, where we see kind of like, you see your opponent as not just wrong, but evil, and also stupid. Somehow, simultaneously, like evil and a craven, but also like the dumbest person alive. And so I think that it's worth not thinking that and thinking about like this person with whom I disagree, where did they get this perspective? Why are they saying this? How did they get there? What was the road to this viewpoint? And trying to understand that and trying to understand the backing that they have for that viewpoint. Maybe you challenge that research, maybe you challenge that backing, but you think about it, think about their views, even if they aren't. Even if you know that like you just made this up. You can think about it as like, okay, what's the best case analysis of it? And then you can like break that analysis down and do whatever you want to do there. But I think that's how I think about it. I think we had... Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming. The kind of world that I'm hearing seems to be like an ideal place. I don't know, at least I'm much older than many people here, but I'm a second-year Rutgers law student, and the world where freedom of speech exists as an assumption has either shrunk to the point where I can't even see it, or it doesn't exist anymore. So bringing up questions like extrajudicial determinations of what hate speech is, or when speech is violence, for example. For example, the New York Times dethroning its editor for admitting an article by Tom Cotton, for example. What to do when someone says your speech is violence? How to, have you experienced that in your professional experience, and have you seen anybody on your laterally to you, do you see people censoring themselves to move on with their career, and are there institutions that allow and promote freedom of speech, are they falling apart, or do you see them strengthening?
So I think you asked a couple of good questions. With regard to self-censorship, I think that is, I will say that is prevalent. I would also argue that that's not new. That's something that is very common, especially if you are within a particular communication speech or particular communication space. You understand pretty quickly what's permitted and what's not permitted, and not even permitted as in like written down, but just sort of like what speech is promoted and what speech is not promoted. And so I think that type of self-censorship, it's not good, but it is also very old. And I think about the ways that, I know I referenced kind of LGBT history previously, but I think about the ways that gay people were pushed out of the federal workforce through the so-called Lavender Menace, which that doesn't even sound menacing, but it was an effort to push out all gay people out of federal employment, and resulted in numerous suicides and just truly horrific treatment. And you have to imagine the self-censorship that went on when you would know, like, this is wrong, but you're not going to say anything about it. And I think that we see that, throughout history and throughout numerous circles. I think that there are a lot of people, I talk to a lot of folks in conservative media, and there are people who have lost radio shows or very clearly got the message that they better get on board with X message or they're kind of SOL. So I think it's not good, but it's when you have a community of any type, and a workplace in some ways is a community, though work isn't your family. Remember that. Your workplace is not your family. Your family and your friends are your family. Your work is where you work. This is very important if you ever get into salary negotiations about anything. But I think that's when you have a community, you have a norm that community either explicitly or implicitly sets. That norm is not necessarily good, but it is normative, and people work towards that norm, and people who work away from that norm are pushed out. And so I think that the thing about speech is that speech is constantly changing and shifting, and what again is hate speech and what is determined to be violent speech. I think in many ways, I think that the conversation about speech being violence, I think it came from a very specific area of people thinking about, like, when you use language, and we can think of many different kinds of language that this would apply to, that is anathema within a community, there's this way we do this thing where we're like, this isn't just bad, we need to go level up from bad. And then we think about it as being a weapon in and of itself, which it isn't, but we have this idea that in some ways it is equivalent to it, even though it isn't. So I'm actually, to your latter question, I'm actually pretty hopeful about the future of speech. And I note that, for one thing, I think that we have more opportunities, and the availability of platforms and places to speak is bigger than ever. And especially with the widening of public spaces and public online spaces in ways that we never really saw possible. I do think it's funny that, like, the people who created the internet were like, we'll all come together and do good things. And I'm like, humans. Always getting in the way by trying to do weird porn things on the internet. I think that to me is a sign of hope. I think that the discussions that we're having right now about what speech is and what speech can be, I think are signs of hope. I think that One thing that's also important is that the speech that you find permissible is of equal interest to me as the speech that you find anathema. And why you think that's permissible and why you think something else is not. Because I've noticed that there's a tendency within our own political silos where we're this brave person standing up saying this, and we get a lot of applause from the people who like us, and then we say something they don't like and they stop applauding. And I think that type of siloing, it's not new. It just happens now to be happening in a very public, projected way. But I think I am hopeful about what speech looks like. I'm hopeful about the increasing venues for speech. I'm hopeful about the number of people who are willing to go to bat in a court for speech. And I would say that the best way to contribute to that is to take opportunities to speak, but take them seriously. I don't like the kind of positional speech where it's like you're saying a thing purely to enrage the right people. Say a thing because you believe in that thing. Stand up for that thing. And don't just say like, oh, they're trying to cancel me because you said something stupid. Please don't do that. That's all I ask. Do we have time? Hi.
So I work at fire, and something we're always trying to figure out is how can you convince people who don't believe in free speech for everyone to believe in free speech for everyone? Good way to end, right?
I regret to inform you that that will be hard. I think the best way is to think about the unintended consequences. If you're trying to convince a person, an actual human being who is flawed and, man's propensity to sin and all that, the best way I have found is by thinking about the way that the curtailing of speech impacts people they like, even if they support the legislation that created it. So, for instance, there is a lot of talk about, gun rights restrictions. And so I am opposed to restrictions on gun rights, personally. So, but when I'm talking to someone, I think about, the way that gun restrictions were wielded against African Americans from time immemorial. In Florida, following the end of slavery, freed African Americans were not permitted to own guns or bullets. And there were people who would go from house to house to make sure you didn't have bullets because you would not have the means to defend yourself against extrajudicial murder. And so when I talk to people about that, they're like, well, that's fun. And I'm like, so, ergo. Now, many times they don't go with me on the ergo, and that's okay. But I think making the case for speech, regrettably, many people are totally fine with their speech, but not fine with your speech. But I find that reminding people that the curtailing of the speech you dislike many times will get to you. And even if it doesn't, it's still wrong, especially because the curtailing of that speech generally is aimed not at a speaker who you might dislike, but at the type of that speech. And there will be times where we see, for instance, someone being penalized for teaching a portion of something that contains racist epithets or something like that, where you're like, clearly you are not the person saying this thing, but you're getting penalized for that anyway. Or you're seeing in some locales people who are being punished for or want the punishment of people whose we always see people who are punishment for viewpoints they find anathema, but even for attempting to describe what those viewpoints are. And so I think that I wish you didn't need to appeal to the inherent selfishness of the human person, but you gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet. So I would say arguing on behalf that when you're fighting for someone else's speech, you're fighting for your own speech. even if you know they won't do it, they will not reciprocate because people are jerks. But that's how I would do it, and that's how I do it when I have these conversations. Awesome. Okay. Awesome. Thanks, guys.